I'd wait a few more moments to get started, also because Carsten, who will do the most of the presenting today, is not here yet. Meanwhile, David or Ira, could you help with the minutes? I see Marco on the CodeMD. Can I take this as a sign that you would help whoever does the main minutes, or even take that role?
Works for me.
Thank you. And I think presenter-wise we are now complete. So I'll start this meeting. Hello, everyone. This is the CBOR meeting at IETF 111. We're meeting in San Francisco, as you all know. As this is an IETF meeting, please be aware that the note well applies. It's Friday, so you've all seen this a few times. A point that I'd like to emphasize is that this is not only about IPR, but also about general patterns of being nice to each other and being collaborative. Also, this meeting is being recorded. The first point of the agenda is the agenda bashing. So I'll run through this quickly. We're having a few working group documents where I'll start with what has been published, and then Carsten will take over and go through the documents. There's already one change that's not reflected in the agenda yet. That is that Carsten will do the main talking also on Michael's documents, because Michael is switching back and forth between another meeting that happens at the same time. And then we have notable tags and the CDDL freezer as individual documents that may not stay like that forever. And if you sum that up, we'll have a few minutes to spare, and let's hope we make good use of our time. Any comments on that? Anything you'd like to bring up now before we go over to the actual documents? Hearing nothing, and I hope that's not due to my audio. Let's go on to RFC 1990, which was released just about 2 weeks ago. Thanks to Carsten, Shaw, and all the reviewers. This used to be tags OID and will be put into good use in various kinds of documents that would deal with object IDs but want to do this in a CBOR environment. Next up is the rest of the documents on which Carsten has slides. Carsten, I suppose you'd like to share them yourself, or shall I do that for you?
I can do that.
With that, floor is yours.
Oh, the bar with the slide numbers is in a different place than it was before. That just stopped me in my tracks. Okay, so
Can I send video?
Oh, sure. Okay. I think I have 52 minutes to talk about 10 documents. Some of them need more talking than others, so I will be very brief, and your job is to slow me down when that is not appropriate, when we need to talk more about that. So let's talk about things that are essentially done. RFC 1990 was mentioned. CDDL control completed working group last call. And the one thing we did was to make .NET both-handed. It was right-handed before, and the tool already has been updated, so you can play with it. And what I need to do in the next few hours after the meeting is process Christian's remaining comments and submit a -04. And then we should have an ISG submission soon. So if you still have any problems with that, saying that within the next few hours would be good, or saying that in the IETF last call, which comes next, would be good. We have two documents whose working group last call ends today, and they're both Michael's documents. So the CBOR file magic is a very nice document. I think we really have achieved what we wanted out of that. But there was no feedback whatsoever in the working group last call. And one problem with that is that I'm now a co-author, so I couldn't send my review. And I probably need to make a habit out of sending reviews for documents that I'm a co-author on. So please look at this document. It's not big, but it will shape the way we will be labeling our files going forward. So we have to get that right. One question is whether we want to do the other tags registration. We already have 55,800 registered, but do we want to do the content format tags that are proposed in the appendix as well at this point in time? So that would be a nice thing to give feedback for here or on the mailing list. Yeah, so please review this document and send feedback. I have reviewed it, it's good feedback. I have reviewed it, and please put the comma there, is even better feedback, or maybe you even have a technical comment. The other one is network addresses, where we had some pretty lively discussion on various aspects, and thanks, John. And I think we have converged on having formats for addresses, for prefixes, and for addresses with prefixes like you would find in an interface specification. One last minute, last hour, last week comment that came up was, do we actually want to address zone IDs? For instance, the Yang IPv6 address data types do support zone IDs. That's these %EN0 things you probably have never seen because you haven't used that feature yet. We got some interesting feedback from Yang people that the fact that these are included in Yang IP addresses makes it too easy to actually specify a zone by mistake when you didn't want that. So that was an interesting point. The other point is that the whole zone ID thing is pretty fluid at the moment because RFC 6847, which tells you how to put the zone ID into URI, is being revisited. And so we also have some confusion about zone IDs versus zone names versus zone numbers. And 4007 tells you that zone numbers are the canonical way, but most people seem to be using zone names at this point. Of course, a constrained application would probably actually prefer zone IDs. It's probably a good idea to wait for that discussion to end and go ahead with the unzoned network addresses first. And I would expect the zone IDs to be addressed by draft IETF core href, which defines the URI, the concise URI format, the CRI format. And there we certainly need to put in a way to do zone IDs in the 8647 way. So with that, I think Michael is pretty much ready to submit a new version of the network addresses, and we do need comments on FileMagick, and then we can move these two documents forward. Any comments? Okay. So what we recently adopted was the draft IETF CBOR time tag. That has actually been a stable document for a while. And I think what we need to decide now is that something that we want to add to now? Or is that stable document good enough as a V1? And you can always go ahead and define more properties that can go into the map defined by this document. So we are not in a particular rush. The tags are all registered. They are partially in use in implementations already, so people are happy that they can use all this. But of course, we want to publish it at some point. But we need to find out whether we do this incrementally or wait for all the interesting discussions to complete. So whatever the answer to that question is, what we need now is reviews again. First of all, from a point of view of an implementer who has to do things with time in a way that maybe is not covered by tag 1 and tag 0, that would be a good thing to look at. Tag 0 is currently being discussed in the sedate working group. Did that actually get started now? I forget what its status is.
Yeah,
anyway,
it started at this IETF meeting. Yeah.
Very good. So I think we can just see what happens there and either update our tag 0 or come up with another text-based tag. And for the binary-based tag 1, this tag 1001 and the related tags are an extension with more functionality. So you can actually say this is TAI and not UTC and so on and so on. So we need reviews from people who are programming this stuff. Of course, it would also be good to get 1 or 2 reviews from people who really know their way around times. So some real time nuts would be great to have as well. So again, that's... Go ahead.
Bron?
Yeah, I was just coming over here to say, to let people know about the sedate working group. Apologies that I haven't really been paying much attention to what's going on in CBOR. I will review this document to cross-check whether anything is an issue with sedate. I'm one of the sedate working group chairs, and certainly anyone who is interested in this, please do come and contribute to sedate as well. I'm very keen to make sure that everything's cross-compatible between the 2 specs. Thanks.
Yeah, sedate is text. This is binary. So whatever sedate standardizes that goes beyond what is already in time tag, we probably want to adopt sooner or later as additional fields in that map. So we're certainly going to follow sedate with interest. Okay, packed. Packed has been around for a while as a draft, and we are essentially waiting for more independent implementation work. And based on that, we will probably fix the definition of table building in the document. So I'm pretty sure that the shared prefix suffix tags that are in the document right now work as they are. But we need to build the tables that these reference. And maybe we have to think about other modes that are interesting. So I'm going to talk about Chris Zip's records at the end. And there's also the template definition. So I think these are 2 candidates that could go in there as well. Or maybe we don't even need them to go in there. Maybe we can define packed in such a way that you can just put backpacks on the packed specification. And if you need templates, you just use them and make sure that you understand how they actually enter the table building. So that's various approaches are thinkable there, and we need to find out what we want to do. Yeah, use cases are probably needed to actually exercise these implementations. And we have a nice set of C509 objects that from John Batson that I plan to work on with my implementation. Unfortunately, those uncovered a bug in my implementation, and I didn't have time before the IETF to fix the bug. But that's certainly one thing we will look at. But if you have other use cases, please try this out. Please go ahead and write your own implementation for your area of work. And maybe also think about use cases where you would need nested dictionaries. So for instance, if we have a static dictionary that goes with a particular area of application, then we want to make sure that the static dictionary, which is defined outside the CBOR data item, works together with any dictionary that is, any table setup that is defined inside the document. So having good use cases for that would also be useful. So yeah, my question would be, is that something we want to think about, possibly splitting the document between table setup and the referencing tags, because those are starting to get stable. Maybe we want to do this entirely without a basic table setup. In that case, the referencing tags would be defined but not usable. Or maybe we want to put in just a simple basic table setup, approximately what's in the current document, and wait for more understanding of our use cases and so on before we do the more complicated table setup mechanisms. So that's essentially the question I would have to the working group. Of course, we also should be talking to our various customers. Suit might have been a customer, but we were too slow for that, but it's still a use case we can try to fulfill. But there are also other working groups that maybe can use this out of the area of attestation and security and so on. And we could throw CORIM or COSWID or something like that in there and see whether there's anything useful happening.
Okay, Brendan, you have a comment?
Hi, Brendan Moran at the mic. And speaking in terms of what we would have done in suit if we'd adopted CBOR-packed, we definitely would need nested dictionaries, and not one pre-shared and one received with the manifest, but in fact 2 dictionaries or even more in a single manifest envelope. And the way that this would work is that suit has a few pieces that get put into a container. And there's one of them that's signed and the others are authenticated by digest. So when the point of this is that they can be removed, and the removable pieces would also want to be able to make use of the table that's in the signed part. The other parts might have their own metadata that needs to be packed separately. And so those tables would need to be discarded when the metadata that they are with gets discarded. So essentially, we would end up with a tree of tables. So I want to encourage this working group to think really hard about how to get nested tables right, because that's a really important use case if we were to ever revisit this in suit.
Just a question for understanding this. Did you say that there is this tree with the innermost thing being the non-detachable part, but the definition from in there would be used outside of that tree as well?
So the idea would essentially be that the root of the tree is the shared table, but then each of the leaves in the tree have their own table, and that's simply because they are detachable from the root. They wouldn't ever be used separate from the root. They'd be discarded, just to be clear.
Chris, do you want to take that to the mic?
Yeah, I've got a potential use case in the area of URI signing tokens. The CD&I working group produced is producing an excellent draft that uses JWTs for a lot of this, and so playing with CWTs and because when we're talking about URI signing tokens, putting them in, putting them into the URI spaces of the essence. So I don't believe you can actually pack a CWT, but when we're defining our own thing, it could look a lot like a CWT but packed, right? And so we're looking at exploring this particular space. Yeah, go on.
Do you have a spec that you could point to?
I don't, unfortunately. And even more unfortunately, the folks doing this work would prefer not to do it in the IETF. So it's an out of space customer. So it's a very interesting use case.
Yeah, so I'm just
wondering a lot of value here.
How we can organize the information flow so we understand that use case well enough to make sure that we come up with a design that covers it.
Yeah, the best case scenario is I convince him to bring it to the IETF.
Okay, so we will pester you for information about this. Well, Bron says fields like XML namespaces, and actually the one document that pushed us forward with doing this packed work is the Coral document, which is essentially doing something a bit like XML namespaces in the form of queries. And that's another form of packing long URIs. So I think this is all pretty much related. There's really nothing new under the sun here. Yeah, again, we have to make sure that our design actually works well with it. And it's going to be more complicated than queries. Thanks.
I got in the queue, but it sounds like there's nobody else in there, so I'm going to pop in with another thing. One of the other challenges that we've had just in the area of using CBOR just generally for efficient document transfer is that sometimes when you're, if I have a client that is asking for, XML, JSON, or CBOR, then they use the accept encoding to signal that. I don't currently have a way to use accept encoding to signal that I want packed CBOR, because packed CBOR is really quite different than regular CBOR. Technically, it is just CBOR, but you're not going to understand it unless you understand packed CBOR. And so, we can use out-of-band signaling mechanisms, but it feels like it should be CBOR plus packed or something. There should be some way to signal in the MIME type that this fairly sizable extension to CBOR should be understood if you're seeking to request this document.
Yeah, one way to address this one would be to actually go for another structured syntax suffix. So you could actually combine that in the same way that you are combining plus CBOR today. And one interesting thing about structured syntax suffixes is that they don't nest, which is a bit weird in this case, but I think that's not really a big problem.
Christian Amses from the floor. But isn't this the same with basically any CBOR extension, not only packed, that it may or may not be part of a particular document? I mean, you usually what you do when you request with accept with say an XML, JSON, or CBOR format is that you don't say you just take CBOR, but you just take a particular instance, a particular shape of CBOR, and then that shape could mandate the use of packed CBOR, or could have a distinction between whether it can use that shape or that shape with packed, but it might have profiling on it that says that you can only do these or those packings, and it might also, in its versioning or features, allow other tags. So I'm not sure a structured suffix would be the solution here.
Right. So you had, I hope I'm not interrupting. I realized that what I was suggesting you could be infinitely detailed about, right? You could try to like describe all possible extensions and all types that you understand, and that's obviously crazy. But if you have packed CBOR feels kind of special to me, right? It's one really big component. And most of the complexity on what you support for packed CBOR is different ways you support putting it together and encoding it, right? How smart are your various table formats and whatnot? Whereas on the accepting it, on the parsing it, it's really fairly straightforward. You follow the rules. And so packed CBOR feels different to me, but maybe it's not.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about CBOR-packed is that you essentially can combine it with any existing CBOR specification. So it's kind of orthogonal in the same way that, for instance, the content coding is orthogonal. Now, of course, we don't really want to make content coding out of that, because there's a little bit more that you want to know about how to use this. It's not like putting this through deflate. You want to know what kinds of structures does the application have to support. But I think it's kind of orthogonal. So yeah, I see a certain value in treating this as a structured syntax suffix, but I also see the combinatorial explosion we could cause by that. Okay, but taking the requirement that we need to do something to make this an acceptable feature, I think that's a pretty good feedback we should look at. Okay, I think we are kind of running out of time with this one.
We don't have a hurry. We are a bit ahead of time, but maybe I didn't allocate enough for notable tags and freezes. So go ahead if there are no more questions.
Okay, Alexei reminds us that content coding has to work with any media type, not just CBOR, and yeah, not quite exactly. Okay. Then there is the draft-bermann-ebor-notable-tags document. That's an individual document. It's currently not really a draft, but more like a skeleton of a draft that really needs some tender loving care. So the observation is that the tags registry is just this unsorted brain dump, and if you are approaching that and wondering what's the best way to put in a 128-bit floating point number into CBOR, that registry is not going to be very helpful. So the idea is to have a document that provides an overview over important tags. That doesn't mean that other tags are not important, but Of course, if you care about cheese firmness, and there is a tag for cheese firmness, you will find it. But if you care about floating point numbers, there's lots of stuff in there. There's rational numbers and all kinds of interesting stuff. And it's probably good to have some narrative which part actually needs to be used for what. So my hope was that this document could also be a little bit more opinionated than the registry, but we already have started with that. So the network address document refers to tag 261 and says that's interesting, but unfortunately it's underspecified, so you cannot use it. So I think we when that's true, we just have to take that opinionated view as well. And that document might be a replacement for trying to add something like a recommended column or something, where we say, oh, this is something you should use, and this is something you should maybe use less. And that's problematic because a tag may be used in a particular application specification, and that application specification doesn't suddenly become out of date just because they are using a tag that is less flexible than what we have. So it's a little bit different from security specifications, where a specification really gets out of date and broken, and you should no longer use it. So we shouldn't use that as a model, and that's why we don't have recommended columns, but instead have this document. So yeah, the discussion came up whether we should add something like a recommended column, and this is essentially just a reminder we have this document and pull requests are welcome. Yeah, this needs lots of more work before it really becomes useful, but we can do that incrementally. So at some point, we can write the section about the CBOR number system and which tags support it, and then we can do something else. So this can grow over time. I think this will be a couple of years before it really is useful. And of course, the question is, when do we publish it then? Because publishing it is kind of anathema to it being a current directory. Anyway, so I think we don't have immediate rush to move this forward, but we also have this as a work item that actually can help people who are not finding the right tags. Christian.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add here is that if we get this into a shape where it can at least be a working group document, then there is the option, and I've clarified this with Ayana, that we refer to this document in the registry. So the registry note currently just basically describes what tags are, and with basically working group consensus and AD blessing, we can update that note to refer to a future IETF CBOR-notable-tags document that would then be something that, even while not published, is usable guidance for people using that registry.
Yeah, Ira makes a comment that comes up repeatedly, maybe not publish that at all, but use a wiki. Now, the problem with wikis is that there's essentially no quality control over those at all. So having a document with a revision history and comments and pull requests and so on is probably a good idea. And when we did similar things in the ROC working group, we did decide at some point to actually publish it because it had a shape where it was useful. But of course, further issues came up later on. So it's just okay to publish a working document at some point and then start with a BIS right away. Yeah, we don't really have this running document category in the IETF. We have a rather one-dimensional publishing mechanism, and I think we need to accept that and make the best out of that. So I think we should stay within this, but maybe keep this active as a working group document for quite a few years. In ROC, it was about 5 years until we finally published it. Okay, let me move forward to some newer stuff. So we have this freezer document that we generated briefly before 8610 was published, the CDDL specification. And that was good for 2 reasons. It captured what we had in mind, and it also was a freezer because we could say, yeah, this is a good idea, but we are going to do this in the next version. And we'll put the idea in the freezer so we can get it fresh from there when we finally have time to do this. And we did quite a few of those things in terms of control operators. So I think we have like 10 more control operators than 8610 had. But the question is, when do we actually touch the language again? And we can probably group what's in there into 3 categories. One is more control operators. There are a few things in there, but I think they can stay in the freezer for a while. We are not that hungry for them at the moment. So I think we pull them out when we have a use case that can immediately make use of that. So I think that some people would be pretty happy with the bitfield design, but we have to work on that a little bit more. So that's maybe an exception to what I had here. And Christian, of course, has a great idea how to do bitfields with .cat, but yeah. So yeah, the second point is things that really would change the language. So I'm sure we have to work on cuts for CDDL 2.0. I'm not so sure we need to work on a literal syntax. So I said give one a 0 and one a minus. We definitely will have to put in the clarifications that we are collecting. So there are some errata that have errata reports that have some good clarifications now that are in the document. We may want to do something about co-occurrence constraints. I think something came up today that brought that thing up again. But I think what people really are asking for now are namespaces and cross-universe references. So how do I actually make use of that particular concept? So we just had that in the bundle spec, in the GTN bundle, where the security spec, of course, needs the CDDL from the base spec. And right now that's just there in English. So you have to sit down and actually copy and paste all that stuff. And that's getting tedious. So we need a good way to actually export things from a document and to import it into another document. So I have some slides on that. And then there are some other things that are essentially independent of CDDL itself. They can just be additional documents. So for instance, the alternative representations section. I think at some point we want to have canonical AST, abstract syntax tree, for CDDL, so tools can interoperate based on that canonical AST. But that's something that doesn't have to be synchronized with the rest of the CDDL development at all. So we can do that at any time we want. And right now there is a workable AST spec in the freezer documents. So I really want to talk about namespaces and the cross-universe references now. And basically, when we defined The character set for an identifier, we already decided that we wanted to be we want to have a few more characters in there than people usually put into identifiers, not to make the job of the people who write code generators harder, but to be able to be flexible with what we do with these names. And so RFC 8610 in its prelude defines something that's called int. And really you would like to be able to reference this as RFC 8610.int, just like RFC 1990 defines something called oid, and you would like to be able to point to that and make sure you really mean the oid from 1990 and not some oid somebody else did at some point in time. So yeah, that's the basic syntax that I would propose, simple namespacing. And then we would need essentially two operators, export and import. I have put these into conventional comments here in the example. That doesn't mean it needs to be that way, but that makes it easy to have them in CDDL documents that might be used by CDDL implementations that don't do namespaces yet. The 3 lines oid, roid, pen here are actually from RFC 1990. And if 1990 had an export statement, we would say these are the 3 that we actually want other specifications to use. And there are some examples in 1990 where definitely we don't want these to be referenced, but of course people can still copy paste that. So yeah, we could simply import that. Something weird happened with the syntax here. So we could just use an identifier here and assume that the tool knows that a name that has a dot in it and starts with RFC and 4 or 5 numbers might be an external reference. So this would be just on the conventional side. Or we could have special syntax that, for instance, imports oid from RFC 1990 and also puts that into the namespace of the current specification. So you no longer have to qualify it with RFC 1990, but can just use it. So that's something that's pretty well known from programming languages, and we probably just need to see how much complexity do we actually want here, and confine us to the complexity we can bear, and still get something readable, because having namespace prefixes all over the place probably isn't too nice either. So one related question is how do we export things? Well, in a new RFC we could use the new syntax. But in an existing RFC that already has CDDL in it, and there are a couple dozen now, it probably is convenient to assume something like there is an export all in there, and so we can just import them wholesale, or maybe just a section like Appendix D of RFC 8610, which is the prelude. And yeah, what we probably need to do is find a space where people can find these pieces of CDDL, and so they don't have to do what I had to do today, copy, paste, and fix CDDL from the spec just so I can check it. Brendan.
I'm wondering if you have any plan to handle specs that kind of define CDDL but don't actually, like Cosé. Where you end up needing to run a script which may or may not work in your programming language of choice in order to extract the CDDL.
Yeah, so that script actually works. So in
Python,
that
it doesn't.
Pardon me?
I said not in Python, it doesn't.
I am polyglot. So I think the script I'm currently using is Perl. But yeah, so the idea would be that we have a space where people can reference those fully extracted pieces in a way that tools can actually make use of that. It could be in GitHub, it could be at IANA, I don't know. So they wouldn't have to do all the work each time they need this.
If IANA has an API, then I have a strong preference for putting it there.
Okay, can you send a pointer to that, to the mailing list, or maybe into the notes? Thank you. So once we have something like that, we can just include from that focal space where these specifications live, and we might even want to include other documents, like the European Digital Green Card specification, or other places that define schemas that would be useful to have available in CDDL form. So I think we should plan for that being a part of the solution, and have syntax that just seamlessly makes use of that. So yeah, so we have essentially two operations: an export, which adds a prefix and makes the namespace available to other specs, and maybe at some point we want to hide things in a document and say, yeah, this CDL is in this document, but it's really not meant for you to use it. It's just an example, or it's a bad example. So maybe we don't just want to wholesale export everything, but have an interface that is a bit more selective about that. So one hack that we can use in XML is in XML we can define a file name for every piece of source code that is in the document, and we could just simply come up with a file name convention that we use to indicate which parts are meant for extraction and which parts aren't. So that's the export side. And on the import side, again, we need to pull stuff from a source and then either use it in a namespaced way or unprefix it and use it in an unprefixed way. And we already are doing this in one place. The prelude defined in Appendix D of RFC 8610 is implicitly included in every CDDL specification. Okay, so what's the temperature reading here? So yeah, we need to find a solution to finding those things. We maybe even want to do something like an something BIS that actually changes the namespace, version numbers. Oh my God. Yeah, so there are quite a few things that come up when you start working on this in earnest, and I think we are going to need a design team working on this sometime in autumn, and I have a few candidates that I hope will be interested in this, and maybe we could set this up after the summer break. Who in this room knows what a twiddle walker is?
At least I don't, so please explain.
It's a way to do an optimistic or pessimistic version reference from a place where a versioned input is being referenced, and I think we need something like that. Okay. Yeah, unless people have great ideas on the spot, please post your great ideas to the mailing list, and be ready to work on this when we get to it later this year, because I think we should have a complete design by the end of this year, or at least by IETF 113. Good. Let's talk about the last two documents. The map-like data document is pretty much solid from my point of view, but it probably does make sense to do further checking of how map-like data are used in various platforms and environments. So Emil is working on that, and I mistyped his name. I'm sorry. Yeah, so I would expect that this will be done before IETF 112. But the remaining question that we didn't answer is, do we do the same thing for lists and sets? So if you look closely, then maps are actually sets of pairs. So maybe we want to address the other sets as well. We already have one tag defined for sets. But for instance, we don't have a way to indicate a list as supposedly unique. We can say that in CDDL at some point, maybe. Yeah, so what else do we need here? How important is that for people? Do you feel constrained by not being able to identify the specific kind of list or set that an array represents? Okay, nobody cares.
To get a bit of a feeling, oh, Brandon, please.
So I care very much about one specific use case, which is a list of pairs, but where the pairs aren't actually encoded as pairs, they're just alternating items in the list. Essentially, an array of key values that would be a map if it didn't have a list tag.
Yeah, but that's already in the current document.
Yes, indeed. So I don't really have other feelings about lists and different ways of doing that. That's the only one I really care about.
Yeah, in the Ruby environment, you actually represent a set as a map that only ever has the value true, which is probably not how you want to interchange it, but these are often stepchildren. Christian, you wanted to get some temperature reading?
I was kind of hoping for a chance to use this show of hands tool to just get a rough impression of who has had at least a rough look at the document as it is now, or as it was in the -00 version from the room, to get a bit of a better view on the interest on the working group. So I'm starting a show of hands now with read some version of maps. So please raise your hand if you have read some version of that, and I'd like to use the do not raise hand for I really don't care about this, like about applications of this. If anyone has trouble finding the show of hands tool, then please just unmute yourself and let me know. Otherwise, I'll close this in a few seconds. Okay, so that's in a room of I'll have to take the numbers later because it's a bit mixed with the Java users, but in a room of an estimate of 30 people actually participating, that's 5 people who have read this and 2 that don't care at all. So there is some interest, but it would be good if there are more people that are interested to voice their opinions on the mailing list, because otherwise this looks a bit low profile right now.
Yeah, there's a reason why we haven't done this in 2013. I mean, you can always get by with what we have. It's just that it sometimes would be nice to not have to invent new stuff each time you do a new CDL specification or invent a new presentation. Brendan.
You can get by with what we have now, and while arguably that is correct, it's not as easy as it sounds. So I came across the need for this when I was attempting to do code generation for a parser, for a schema-based parser. And the issue that I found was that if I tried to do code generation for a schema parser, my code could not tell the difference based solely on the syntax, on the AST, between a list and a list of key value pairs. There was simply no way to tell them apart other than a few kind of ancillary things around it. It's incredibly difficult to do properly. So I would argue that this is not, in fact, something where you can just get by. This is actually needed if you care about code generation at all.
Okay, I certainly will agree with that. I want to use the last 3 minutes for the last slide, which is about records. The word record has a meaning in CDDL, so this is not exactly the same meaning, but it's the meaning that Chris has been using here. So it's essentially a bit like the way you would look at a CSV, a comma-separated values document, where you have a first line that tells you what's in there, and from then on you just have lines that have the actual data, and you get the meaning of these data by association from the column that they are in. And what Chris proposed was essentially a bit like CBOR-packed for these records. So you would say something like, I have a record with a name and an address, and each time I use that particular tag, I mean that the 2 values that I have here actually are a name and an address. And there are 2 aspects to this. One is the semantic identification, by saying the tuple that you actually see there represented as a CBOR array is actually record data. And then, of course, there is the compression aspect, that you don't have to repeat the what would be map keys in JSON each time this is used. Now, the specific proposal relies on ordering, and it's great that the Meet Echo managed to actually get this encoded correctly. So much better than what I saw in the previous meetings. Anyway, so that may be something we have to look at, but I think that's the less interesting part. The interesting part is really, should we look at this in the CBOR-packed framework, and should we do the rest of that in a kind of semantic tagging? Or yeah, I think that there are many ways to look at this, and I would like people to actually look at this proposal, which is currently just on GitHub and not an internet draft, and think how they would fit into the packed framework and also into other frameworks like the way we're doing CineML and so on. So we can pick this up and make it part of our portfolio. So CSV would just be a degenerate case of that, and more complex situations in which you mix records of different kinds would be fully addressed by this. So maybe you want to use your show of hands tool again.
That's actually not a bad idea. So with the question, once I get the right tab open, is being should this be probably pulled in with packed. So please raise your hand if you have a preference for this being in packed, and do not raise your hand explicitly if you would like to keep those topics separate.
Well, that's really a difficult question, and I really would like to raise my hand.
Yes.
For we need to think about that, but we do need to think about that, which is different from I don't care.
But I think that we do need to think about this is pretty much the outcome with 3 hands raised and 3 hands not raised. So this definitely warrants a bit more discussion on the mailing list.
Yeah.
Because we are actually running out of time here now, but I think we are also out of large topics, so this would be a good point to conclude this meeting, unless someone has something urgent to raise still.
Do you want to say something about interim meetings?
Thanks for the reminder, indeed. Interim meetings, there is no fixed time yet when they will continue, but the current plan is to continue them at the 2-week cadence that they had before, and at least for this year stay within the pattern that has been established, which makes them well compatible with core meetings, which is Wednesday afternoons in European time zones. And if anyone sees an urgent need to reschedule, please please send something to the mailing list, because now would be a good time to do that if it's needed. With the note that it will definitely be tricky to find a spot that works well for the people it works well for yet so far.
So this would be starting mid-September, or what's the plan?
Roughly, yes.
Okay. Good.
Okay. With that, thanks, Carsten, for your 52 minutes of 10 documents. A bit more, actually. Thanks, Marco, for taking minutes, and all of you for your input to this meeting. Have a nice last session and a good flight home.
Yes,
And
everyone fly well. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.